Next, please. Place your finger on the scanner.
When you hear the word homelessness, what picture comes to mind? For most of us, it's that simple surface-level definition. Someone without a place to live or sleep.
Right, that's the common image, kind of the tip of the iceberg. But what happens when you go a bit deeper?
Yeah.
This deep dive, and it draws on a set of sources, including some really personal accounts from someone who actually experienced the shelter system firsthand. Well, it aims to take you beneath that surface.
Okay.
To reveal a reality that's far more complex and honestly often hidden.
Absolutely. So our mission with you today, based on these insights, is really to move beyond the stereotypes. We're going to explore the process of actually entering the system, the challenging daily life inside, the different groups navigating it, and, well, the significant hurdles faced by individuals.
Yeah, it's about understanding what's often unseen and, frankly, deeply misunderstood.
Exactly.
And the first crucial insight these sources offer really challenges that common external view. The idea that homelessness is mainly about individuals who maybe failed in life or are perceived as unclean or mentally unstable.
Right, but the reality presented here seems so much more diverse.
It really is.
It highlights how sudden, often unavoidable crises can push, well, almost anyone into this situation. We hear stories like the gentleman who suffered a work injury.
Yeah, lost his job because of it, couldn't pay rent.
And ended up in a shelter straight from the hospital in winter, wearing only what he had on.
That's brutal. Or, the college graduate with a degree facing just overwhelming medical bills after surgery.
Lost everything. Tried living in his car, I think.
Yeah, and ultimately had to turn to a shelter.
And then there's the security guard, actually working full-time, but the wages just weren't enough for an apartment.
Using the shelter just as a place to sleep between shifts. Imagine that.
It's tough. And the individual with bad credit couldn't get an apartment rental without this huge security deposit.
Right. And hotel costs were skyrocketing, so he made some risky investments kind of out of desperation.
Lost what little he had.
Yeah, and faced a choice. Shelter or, well, starvation. It's stark.
Now, the sources do acknowledge that, yes, mental illness and drug use are factors for some people in this situation. That's part of the picture.
Sure, it's acknowledged.
But the strong emphasis here is that this is absolutely not the whole picture. These accounts show paths driven by injury, medical debt, just plain low income, or bad luck.
Circumstances that really contrast sharply with the judgment, often cast from the outside. That tendency to see it all as personal failings.
Exactly. The sources even mention less common routes, like someone just released from prison with no support system.
Or even losing a home through mortgage foreclosure. It happens.
It just reminds you the pathways are so varied and often really beyond individual control.
So true.
Okay, so if life throws you one of these curveballs, what's the first actual hurdle? Getting into the system itself.
Right. Navigating it.
The sources detail this shelter entrance process, and it apparently begins at what's called a screening agency.
Yeah, think of a screening agency as it's described as this kind of bureaucratic gateway.
Okay.
Is where you have to go just to even start the process of maybe getting a shelter bed.
And the information they collect sounds intense.
Oh, incredibly intrusive, according to these accounts. We're talking name, age, medical history. They take your picture. Fingerprinting.
Fingerprinting, just to apply for shelter.
Yep, fingerprinting.
Yeah.
And a full background check, criminal history, any warrants.
Wow. And the whole purpose of collecting all that personal data is to figure out eligibility and, which category of shelter you fit into.
Precisely. And what's really emphasized in the source is how this feels like a, quote, long process for no reason.
Yeah.
Often taking hours just to get through it all.
Hours.
And after that, shelters are typically segregated. Single males go to one facility, single females to another.
Right. And this is where it gets tricky for families, isn't it? According to the source.
Yeah, very complicated. Some states have family shelters, which is good, keeps people together. But others might actually separate even married couples.
Especially if they don't have, a marriage certificate right there on hand.
Exactly. That can be a real barrier.
And there are limitations within the system too, right? Like for people with serious mental health issues or the elderly.
Yeah, ideally they're supposed to go to specialized centers.
Yeah.
But, when those are full, which happens.
They end up in the regular single shelters anyway.
Right, which might not be equipped for their specific needs at all.
So after going through this really long, intrusive process, what happens if you don't make the cut? Or you're just not accepted for some reason?
Well, the sources recount that you might literally be left asleep outside the agency, on the floor.
Outside.
Yeah, just waiting until the next business day. And if this happens on a Friday or before a holiday,
We could be waiting for days with nowhere else to go.
days. And some agencies apparently won't even let you wait inside their building or even right outside unless you've been formally accepted.
That just highlights the barriers, doesn't it? Just to even get access to help.
Absolutely.
So, okay, let's say you get in. Once inside, the daily reality described sounds consistently harsh and controlling.
Yeah, I think a core insight from the sources about daily life in many shelters is that it's defined by this pervasive lack of control, dignity, and just basic human comfort.
How so?
Well, the schedule is often incredibly rigid, really early wake-ups, typically between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m., sometimes like strictly 5:30 a.m.
5:30 a.m. And I read a particularly difficult detail mentioned for some shelters, the requirement to actually leave the facility during the day.
Yeah, get kicked out, essentially, no matter the weather outside, blazing sun, pouring rain, snow.
That doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. You can only come back later in the afternoon, often around 4 p.m. for roll call.
And if you miss that roll call?
You lose your bed for the night. Simple as that.
Wow. Okay, but what about shelters that do let people stay inside during the day?
Even then, there are still incredibly strict rules described. Like, you are expected to be awake and in an upright position at all times.
Upright. You mean like sitting straight up?
Exactly. No leaning, no sleeping in chairs, nothing like that. It sounds like a constant state of vigilance.
That's exhausting just thinking about it. And meal times. Fixed.
Totally fixed. Breakfast maybe 7 a.m., lunch 12 p.m., dinner 5 p.m., and you need your ID or meal card to get any food.
And this sounds critical based on the source, the almost total lack of food choice.
Huge point. It's described as, quote, either you eat it or you don't get it all.
Which is especially tough for people with specific dietary needs, right? Diabetes, high blood pressure.
Exactly. They're just given whatever is served, regardless of their health requirements. That's the picture painted.
And amenities, showers, laundry, limited.
Very limited. They're available, but getting access means getting in line super early. And there are often limits. Maybe you'd only shower a few times a week.
The source also mentioned wellness checks for showering. What's that about?
Yeah, it adds another layer to the privacy issues, doesn't it? And speaking of privacy,
Showers often have no curtains, is that right?
that's what these accounts say. No curtains.
And other difficult conditions highlighted?
Well, things like unsanitary toilets that aren't flushed, sometimes with fecal matter present, and maybe no toilet paper or plungers available, just left like that.
Grim.
Yeah. And broken water fountains, leading to people being constantly thirsty.
So daily life isn't just about having a roof. It's navigating the system with really strict rules, a lack of basic choice, very limited amenities, and pretty challenging sanitation.
Exactly. And this difficult environment helps explain some of the distinctions the sources make about the different populations within homelessness.
Right, because the visible street population, the people you might see on the subway or asking for money, that's often just a small part of the picture, isn't it?
A very small part.
Yeah.
And that limited view leads to these broad, often inaccurate generalizations about everyone experiencing homelessness.
Okay, so the source identifies sort of three main groups.
Yeah, broadly speaking. First, you've got those currently housed within the shelters, that diverse group we've been talking about, who ended up there for all sorts of reasons.
Okay.
Second, there are those living on the street 24/7. These are often individuals who've maybe been banned from shelters or kicked out.
Or maybe they just choose to avoid this system entirely because of the conditions or the rules we just discussed.
Right. And then there's the third group, the one living visibly on the street.
The ones everyone sees.
Exactly. On the streets, trains, buses. And the source really argues that because this is the group that outsiders, politicians, and the media primarily see,
It leads to these sweeping stereotypes.
yeah, they've given up, they're all troublemakers, oh, they're all drug addicts, they're all mentally ill. The source feels people brush everyone else in the shelter system with this one stereotype.
Because they haven't actually witnessed the full reality inside those shelters.
Precisely. And adding a really disturbing layer to this, the source mentions the presence of individuals who actually pretend to be homeless, specifically to sell drugs inside the shelters.
Seriously, inside the shelters.
That's the claim.
And that must lead to some dangerous situations. Violence.
Yeah, the source mentions violence related to drug debts occurring, often just outside the facilities.
And there was a particularly harrowing story shared, wasn't there?
Yeah, really tragic, about a woman who apparently owed drug money. During a 5 p.m. roll call, inside the shelter.
Someone punched her
Yeah.
related to this debt.
Yeah. And that altercation resulted in her getting kicked out of the facility right then and there.
Kicked out after being assaulted.
And then, tragically, her body was allegedly found just 2 blocks away the very next morning.
That's chilling. Just awful.
It really is. The source also notes this disturbing pattern where sometimes the instigators of these violent incidents might reappear at shelters later.
Well, the victims often just vanish from the system.
Right. Raising serious questions about oversight and safety,
Definitely. And this leads directly into the source's really sharp critique of how some homeless facilities and parts of the system itself operate.
Yeah, there's strong criticism here.
The source is particularly critical of those shelters that force people to leave during the day, right?
Yeah.
Calling it a form of discrimination.
Yes. And the perspective offered is that these specific shelters might look like they're helping or motivating people.
But they offer things the source sees as basically useless.
Pretty much, like work ethics on the corporate environment classes for people who maybe can't even read or write, or telling felons to apply for jobs at the very places they were arrested. It seems counterproductive from this viewpoint.
So why would they do that? What's the source's take on the motivation?
The suggestion is it's about appearances, to show to people who donate that they're doing something, kind of performing for the donors and philanthropists.
So it's more about looking good than actually helping in this view.
That's the strong belief expressed, that this model, rather than helping, is actually destroying more people, potentially pushing them further towards despair, maybe even towards drugs.
The source frames this model quite critically then, suggesting it functions more like a business, focused on keeping the roster full for donations.
Exactly. Keeping beds filled to maximize funding. And suggesting that for some staff, working in shelters is seen more as just a career path, not necessarily an act of volunteering or pure altruism.
And other systemic issues are brought up too.
Oh, yeah. These like rules being set by people who've never actually experienced the system themselves.
Which makes sense. How would they know?
Right. Also, vulnerable individuals being targeted by job scams, people losing jobs they did manage to find because of unreliable external factors like public transport delays they can't control.
That must be incredibly frustrating.
Immensely. And the huge difficulty for felons and registered sex offenders to secure any kind of employment.
And didn't the source mention something about screening agencies rejecting people?
Yes, a really frustrating point. Sometimes rejecting people based on, say, a lack of recent jobs, when the source believes the actual reason is often just a lack of available beds or capacity at the shelters.
So they get turned away for a reason that isn't even the real reason.
And this forces people to be decertified.
Yeah.
Basically, take it off the list of approved individuals, and then they have to go back and get rescreened repeatedly.
Adding layers of stress and just bureaucratic nightmares.
Absolutely. It's a critical look at a system that, from this perspective, can feel more focused on process and funding than on genuine support and rehabilitation.
But it's not all bleak, right? The sources also point to a different approach, offering a kind of model of hope.
Yes, thankfully. The accounts do highlight alternative shelters that sound like they stand in stark contrast.
How are they different?
Well, crucially, these facilities do not kick people out during the day. And according to the source, they prioritize the people over the money.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Their fundamental approach, as it's described, seems genuinely aimed at helping individuals get back on their feet, and importantly, preventing them from returning to that cycle of homelessness.
So more tangible support.
Much more. Things like connecting people with city vouchers that can cover a year's rent, providing counseling to help process trauma and their experiences,
That sounds vital.
linking individuals to other needed resources, helping write job letters, offering clothing vouchers, providing 3 meals a day, and the implication is often better quality or more appropriate food.
Facilitating doctor referrals, too.
Yes, and they even welcome volunteers to come in and help. It sounds much more community-oriented.
And the source explicitly says these shelters.
They put the people first instead of the money. That's the quote. It really shows that a more supportive, person-centered model is possible.
That difference in approach is really powerful. Okay, so finally, these sources seem to vividly illustrate this huge gap between the external perception of homelessness and the actual lived experience.
Oh, absolutely. The parts you just can't see or even begin to imagine from the outside.
Yeah, the source explicitly lists these sensory, physical, and emotional realities that outsiders simply cannot know. You can't smell it, hear it, feel it in the same way.
Exactly, like the pervasive smell that apparently permeates everything inside some facilities.
Or the constant disruptive noise snoring, arguments waking everyone up repeatedly all night long.
It's the fear, too. Fear of verbal or even physical harassment from others in close quarters.
And the physical toll of having zero control over your food when you have serious medical conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure we mentioned.
Yeah, or just the sheer indignity of having to stand outside in freezing rain or scorching sun just to get a meal.
And the exhaustion, having to remain awake and upright all day if you're in one of those shelters that allows staying inside.
Knowing that leaning back or dozing off could mean losing your bed that night.
Plus the anxiety of potentially being arbitrarily kicked out by staff if, as the source puts it, a social worker lost patience. Just like that.
It's the fear of catching sicknesses, too, from others constantly coughing nearby in crowded conditions.
Or the discomfort of having to wear the same clothes and shoes day in, day out, no matter how hot or cold it is.
And that profound lack of privacy, like having to shower with absolutely no curtains.
Encountering those unsanitary toilets that haven't been flushed, maybe filled with fecal matter, with no way to even clean them yourself.
It's the simple nagging discomfort of being thirsty because the water fountains are broken and there's just no other source of clean water readily available.
It's being exposed to the elements, the sun, the rain, the cold, every single day if you're forced to leave the shelter during daytime hours.
It's that grinding stress of frequent rescreening and rejection. Being told you don't qualify when you suspect it's really just about capacity.
Having to go back to the agency multiple times a month, repeating the process.
And even after you get your meal, those small portions might mean you still feel hungry because it wasn't enough to serve everyone adequately.
It's the overwhelming difficulty of trying to find work with a criminal record, or as a registered sex offender, or the risk of falling victim to scams that target your vulnerability.
Or that devastating scenario. Finally securing a job, doing everything right, only to lose it because something totally outside your control, like a bus simply not showing up, made you late.
Sends you right back to square one. Crushing.
Absolutely. And the source expresses real frustration with critics who dismiss these realities, these immense difficulties, as just excuses.
Yeah, that part was powerful. This section of the source ends with a really direct challenge, doesn't it?
It does. It's the hope, expressed quite strongly, that those critics, those people judging from the outside, never, ever have to endure these experiences themselves, not even for a single day.
So we're wrapping this up.
Yeah.
What does this deep dive, guided by these specific sources, really reveal? I mean, it shows us homelessness is so much more than just lacking a physical home.
Definitely. It's a complex state, often entered through diverse, sudden crises. It involves navigating a really difficult, sometimes almost punitive system.
It means facing these harsh daily realities we've discussed, and it encompasses different populations that extend far beyond that visible stereotype we started with.
So hopefully you listening now have a richer, maybe more complete picture, informed by these personal accounts and critiques from the source material.
Yeah, and this leaves us with a pretty significant thought to ponder, doesn't it? Drawing on the immense difficulty detailed here.
What incredible resilience does it actually take for someone to simply survive, let alone begin to recover or even thrive while enduring these conditions day after day?
And maybe, given that stark disconnect between the external perception and this challenging, often invisible reality, what does that mean for how we collectively understand and maybe try to address this issue?
Yeah. As the source challenges us all at the end, can you truly imagine enduring even one day of that experience? Something to think about.